In the deep, dark depths of history, there lies a grim and haunting story that will chill your bones. Imagine a time when the world was shrouded in a mysterious and terrifying plague, a time when the very air you breathed could be your last. This was the 14th century, an era where death loomed around every corner, and the living walked in constant fear. But this story is not just about the plague. It's about the people who tried to fight it, the doctors who toiled day and night, and the terrible things that happened when fear and superstition took hold. In those dark days, doctors were not the white-coated, high-tech professionals we know today. They were men, and occasionally women, who relied on a mix of ancient wisdom, practical skills, and a dash of magic to treat the sick. They were often seen as wise and respected figures, wearing their purple or red gowns and furred hoods, adorned with silver-threaded belts and embroidered gloves. Some even wore golden spurs when they rode to their visits, a sign of their status and importance. These doctors were not just healers. They were also scholars, alchemists, and sometimes even magicians. Despite their sometimes bizarre methods, these doctors understood a lot about the human body. They knew about diet, exercise, and mental health. They could set broken bones, extract teeth, and even perform surgery to remove bladder stones or cataracts. They understood that epilepsy and apoplexy, what we now call strokes, were spasms of the brain, and they used simple but effective tools like urinalysis and pulse checks to diagnose illnesses. They knew which plants could act as laxatives or diuretics, and they had remedies for everything from hernias to toothaches. If you had a headache, they might mix ground peony root with rose oil. If you had a toothache, they might prescribe a mixture of oil, vinegar, and sulfur. But for all their knowledge, there were limits to what these doctors could do. When faced with illnesses they couldn't cure, they often turned to the supernatural. They might use elaborate potions made from rare and expensive ingredients, or they might suggest that the patient pray to a saint for help. For example, if you had ringworm, you might wash your scalp with a boy's urine. If you had gout, you might apply a plaster made from goat dung, rosemary, and honey. Some of these treatments were more about making the patient feel better psychologically than actually curing the disease. When it came to the plague, the doctors tried everything they could think of, from bleeding and purging to lancing and cauterizing the bubo's swollen lymph nodes. They even prescribed exotic medicines made from powdered stag's horn, myrrh, and saffron, or potions containing gold and precious gems, but none of it really worked. The plague was a fierce and unforgiving enemy, and it spread quickly through the cities and towns of Europe. People were desperate for any solution, no matter how strange. Some believed that foul odors could protect them, so they would visit public latrines or carry pomanders filled with aromatic compounds. Others believed that the plague was a punishment from God, and that only prayer and penance could save them. Some cities took drastic measures to stop the spread of the disease. Pistoia, for example, forbade its citizens from returning home if they had been in infected areas, and Venice organized barge services to transport corpses to remote islands for burial. In Milan, the ruler Giovanni Visconti ordered that the first 3 houses where the plague was found be walled up with the sick and dead inside. These measures were often harsh and inhumane, but they were born out of desperation and fear. The plague also brought out the worst in people. As the death toll rose, many began to look for scapegoats. The Jews, who had long been marginalized and persecuted, became the primary targets. Accused of poisoning the wells to spread the plague, Jews were dragged from their homes, beaten and burned alive. This was not the first time Jews had been blamed for disasters, but the scale of the violence was unprecedented. In cities like Narbonne and Carcassonne, Jewish communities were wiped out, and the hatred spread like wildfire. The animosity toward Jews had deep roots in Christian doctrine, which saw them as Christ killers and enemies of the faith. The early church had stripped Jews of their civil rights and forced them to live in segregated communities, making them easy targets for violence and persecution. Despite the official church's stance that Jews should be treated with some degree of respect, in practice, they were often subjected to the worst forms of abuse. They were not allowed to bring charges against Christians, and their testimony was not considered valid in court. They were seen as property of the king, and their lives and possessions were at the mercy of the ruling powers. The kings and nobles often used Jews as moneylenders, exploiting their skills in finance while also exposing them to the wrath of the common people. When the plague struck, the Jews were the perfect scapegoats, and the violence against them reached new heights. The plague did not just affect the living, it also had a profound impact on the environment. As the death toll rose, cities became overwhelmed with the task of disposing of the dead. Streets were filled with the stench of decaying bodies, and the air was poisoned. King Edward III of England wrote to the mayor of London, complaining that the streets were foul with human feces and the air of the city poisoned to the great danger of men passing. The breakdown in sanitation made the situation even worse, and the plague continued to spread unchecked. In the face of such horror, people turned to saints and miracles for hope. St. Roch, a young man who had devoted his life to helping the sick, was believed to have special powers to heal the plague. His story was one of self-sacrifice and divine intervention, and many people believed that invoking his name could save them. But when prayers and appeals to the saints failed, people began to question their faith. Some believed that the plague was a sign of God's anger, and that humanity had grown too wicked to be saved. The poet William Langland wrote, "God is deaf now, days and deigneth not hear us, and prayers have no power the plague to stay." As the plague raged on, the world seemed to be falling apart. But amidst the chaos and despair, there were also stories of resilience and humanity. Doctors continued to treat the sick, even at great personal risk. Neighbors helped each other, and some people risked their lives to care for the dying. The plague was a test of human nature, and it revealed both the best and the worst in people. It was a time of great suffering, but it was also a time when the human spirit refused to be extinguished. In the end, the plague eventually subsided, but its impact on the world was profound. It changed the way people thought about health, hygiene, and the role of government in public health. It also exposed the deep-seated prejudices and fears that had long simmered beneath the surface of society. The 14th century was a time of great upheaval, but it was also a time when people began to question the old ways and look for new solutions. The story of the plague is a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of hope, and that the human spirit can rise above even the most terrible of challenges.